So I think, right? Yeah, we reached the time of our panel. Thank you, Fred. I see you here already, and we'll wait for Stephen. So in this panel, we're going to discuss crisis. And we have two very experienced professionals who work in two very different contexts, which is going to make it interesting. So on the one hand, we have Helio Fred Garcia. You may raise your hand. Fred is a global crisis expert, author of several books on crisis, leadership, reputation, and trust. He also teaches crisis communication at New York University and Columbia, and he's the recipient of several awards. And then Stephen Dong Guanpeng, who's here with us as well, is a professor, scholar, strategic advisor for the Chinese government and private sector. He has spent a great many years working on the promotion of professional journalism and transparent governance in China. And more recently, he advised China's Republic with regard to the Winter Olympics. But before I turn to you, I wanted to come back to two figures that Fred mentioned recently when we were speaking, which illustrate very well the difference between, the management of a crisis can make. And Fred, you told me that the COVID virus killed 1 in 39,000 people in Korea, but as many as 1 in 800 people in the US. And I think this is a very good illustration on, about the way crisis management can make a difference on people. So I'd like to turn to you first, if I may.
Well, thank you. One of the things that I do in my work and in my teaching and in my writing is study patterns, patterns of crisis, patterns of what works and doesn't work, patterns on how people react in a crisis. And patterns have two kinds of power. They have explanatory power, so you can make sense of something in the past, but they also have predictive power on what will come next if we do X or Y or Z. And my next book is on COVID, the COVID response in the United States, contrast with other countries. And what I find fascinating is, for example, the Republic of Korea, what outside of Korea we call South Korea, the Republic of Korea had completely mishandled a public health emergency 7 years ago, and that was Middle East respiratory syndrome. And about 3 dozen people died in that pandemic, but it almost brought down the government. And they were determined not to make those mistakes again. So they convened a conference very similar to this one, but in person. I was one of the speakers at the conference, and they asked me, how does the Centers for Disease Control work? How do institutions coordinate in a response? And we had just come through Ebola. So I was asked to teach about the Ebola example and CDC and best practices in crisis management, not because I taught it, but because they were really committed. They said, we're going to embrace those disciplines going forward. And when COVID happened, they immediately implemented all CDC guidelines, US CDC guidelines. They had a whole of government response. They went to masking, they went to distancing, to tracing, to quarantining, all of the things that the guidelines say they did. In the first year, 1 in every 39,000 Koreans died of COVID. The United States did none of that. And instead, we had fragments of government response. We did not go to mandatory masking as a nation at all. And we violated our own Centers for Disease Control guidelines in the first year. The United States had 1 out of every 800 Americans die. As of this morning, it's 1 out of every 336 Americans have died of COVID. And it is the highest per capita fatality rate for COVID anywhere in the industrialized world. We are 11,000 deaths away from passing the 1 million mark in the United States. And that is genocide level fatalities. And about 900,000 of them, according to all of the scientific experts, was preventable. So my lesson is crisis management works, but only when you apply the disciplines. So the leadership guru Marshall Goldsmith says our challenge is not to understand the practice of crisis management, it's to practice our understanding of crisis management.
Thank you, Fred, and we'll come back to that. In the meantime, I'd like to turn to Stephen. And that's something also we discussed, which was how, your insights about how you think the technology impacted the pandemic and the way in which it was managed. And you can share your experience with that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, my dearest friend, Fred Garcia, give me this great opportunity. And thank you, Iliana. I would like to talk about 5G really, because I've been teaching for 10 years at Tsinghua University. That's a very science and engineering university. It's more than 10 years ago when people first told me, Stephen, journalism education, public relations education will need definitely to teach people about faster and richer 5G in the future. And 10 years ago, I didn't think it's a thing for me at all, because I think I just teach good quality journalism, and I teach good quality public relations principle, the good textbook by my friend, Fred Garcia. That would be really the best. But I'm learning with Fred, because every single time when I went to New York, or maybe we just have a conversation over the phone, I realized that there are new phases of 5G. So at the very beginning, I was thinking international cross-cultural differences, because China become more global. When we are being more global, we are learning. But actually, before we are challenged so much by international differences, was actually from 2019, China become a 5G country. For the first round, Beijing, Shanghai, Wuhan, Shenzhen, those are the cities become mega 5G cities. What really changed the city's PR practices, for example, is the rumors travel 50 times faster than ever before. So when the real information, the facts or the figures, anything real, when they are hesitating, when they are waiting for more confirmation, well, the rumors travel 50 times faster. So that become a terrible threat to any brand. It doesn't matter private brand, commercial brand, even the governmental brand, the city councils, and also the CDCs. Well, something really challenging is 5G challenging China at the same time as the pandemic. So domestically, for a long time, for Wuhan, for the first at least about full months, from January until April 2020, the city was not only struggling with pandemic, but also struggling with the chaos of information, the chaos of no trust from anyone between each other. And I was one of the advisors team, traveled from Beijing from the 12th of February to the center of this pandemic inside China in 2020. When I arrived, I was really confused as well, because my colleagues in the best universities in Wuhan and also Huazhong University of Science and Technology, they told me that, Professor Dong, the conventional, the traditional communication theories are not working here anymore. I said, why? They said, Professor Dong, we need to wait until we have really good journalism. We need to wait until we have very good PR writing to have news released. And then I said, how long do you think that will be? And they say maybe several days. I think that's very bad. And also they said, we had a better press conference yesterday and people were not really happy. Can we wait until we are ready for the text and for many other things ready and then have the next press conference? I said, no. They said, if I continue to have press conference every day, we'll be criticized by people every single minute. I said, we are learning from the new phases of the crisis, because 5G in China, it means that people sometimes will become trusting you After 10 days, 20 days, they have been criticizing you every second. But by the end of 20 days or 30 days, emotional disappearing. But when they really got enough information, and then also because of the CDC medical professionals, they give up a complete picture of the logics and also the information. So honestly, from pandemic to everyday business life in China, the business people, the leaders, and also the PR professionals, we are working out a big new theory about China is the 5G PR, 5G reputation management, 5G crisis communications, because we are really in the big chaos at the moment.
That's interesting because that's not only about China, right? I don't know, Fred, you must also have experienced this on your side, isn't it?
Yeah.
We sometimes can work out, but for many reasons, for many of the cases, we are not working out. So we still need advices from Iliana and Fred, because we need to work together to find out the best way for trust.
Can you, Fred, can you share a real life, I mean, building on what Stephen just said,
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Something real life where this, his concept of 5G, communication.
Yeah, sure. 5G apparently is the fifth generation of mobile internet. In China, not only in the mobile phones, but also is everywhere people have lots of 5G products. For example, these glasses. This is an ordinary one, but this one is a 5G one. It doesn't look very different, but these glasses are 5G connected. I can record not only audibly, but also visually. But the recording is not charming because I can broadcast the live from my glasses. So seeing is not believing, seeing is broadcasting. So for a long time in China, we only have the major media organizations, maybe less than 10 for big events. But nowadays we have billion people telling you billion kinds of very different story for one thing. So people become really lost. Who should I really believe? And who is telling the real story? And something also interesting is those kind of appliances in China are not expensive at all. It's like I have to say it's like $20 or $30 for some of the lighter glasses. I gathered some, and this just give us the challenge that misinformation producers barrier are low enough. It's like a very flat floor. So everybody can do very good things, and everybody can do very bad things. Basically, it's so hard. It's harder than ever for the first 24 hours to find out what's really going on, and that's a big threat for brand, for public brand, and also commercial brand. This one is the one I mentioned is only like $20 to $30, but here is a very big camera, and there are another two. I just, as a professor, I was just fascinated.
Fred, there's a question. Thank you. There's a question for you. Yeah.
Yeah. So Iliana, one of the things that is one of the patterns of crisis management, and this was articulated about 100 years ago by the American author Mark Twain, and that is a lie can get halfway around the world before the truth has a chance to put its shoes on. And that was back when telephone was a big technology. What we found in COVID, in particular in the United States, is the speed and the breadth of misinformation that landed with people. And there's a principle that we know well called the first mover advantage. And that is whoever's the first to define the crisis, whoever's the first to define a motive, whoever's the first to define your actions controls the narrative. And what we found in COVID is, for example, the president of the United States makes an offhand, unplanned comment from the White House podium about the likelihood of injecting or ingesting bleach as a way to prevent or cure COVID. Literally in minutes, that was on the social media platforms and mainstream media platforms, to the point that the disinfectant companies within 2 or 3 hours had to put out statements saying, please don't put our disinfectant in your body. It is not intended to be in your body. And poison control centers started getting just numerous calls of people who tried to gargle with bleach or tried to swallow bleach. And the power of that, I'm not in any way saying it was intentional misinformation, it was just frankly dumb to say something off the cuff at a press conference in the presence of medical experts. But that took on a life of its own. And by the time the medical experts who'd come out and say, hey, whoa, that's not a good idea, the first mover advantage had happened. People who'd heard that the president endorsed this began to follow that guidance. And that's just a tiny example. And there were dozens and dozens of similar, but that's a good demonstration of what Dr. Dong is talking about. Is before you say it from the podium, people read it in the newspaper, they may or may not act on it, but there's immediate validation, immediate sharing, immediate manifestation of the behavior that is at least on orders of magnitude different from before the internet or before 5G. I'll say the pattern hasn't changed. The velocity has changed and the reach has changed.
Before I go to
I
the question
definitely
in
feel
the
the
chat,
same.
before I go to the question in chat, I was wondering, listening to you, what are things that corporations, governments, etc., could put in place as a kind of early warning and then quick management, before that information becomes viral?
And Iliana, that happens to be one of the core offerings that my firm does. We work with companies, we work with NGOs, with universities, with governments to establish a mechanism for tracking potential clients, for having an early warning, to have agreement in advance of who does what. So you need role clarity, agreement in advance on how you do it. You need process clarity. And then you need people to stay in their lane. The biggest challenge with role clarity is not who does what, but how do you get everybody else to not do that? Because in a crisis, what you often find is executives behave the way 6-year-olds play what in the rest of the world is called football and in the United States is called soccer. But that is, you got everybody chasing the ball and nobody actually playing the sport. And we need to get executives, to use the soccer football analogy, to play World Cup level football, not 6-year-olds chasing the ball wherever it might happen to go.
Okay, Stephen, I think you want to add to that?
Yeah, I definitely think so, because I think the changes are not only the speed in China, because speed is the first sign, first the warning sign. And very quickly, the second one is the content. Because for a long time in China, we say, the better the quality, the more chance they will have for the news or for the content of or whatever PR or marketing. But nowadays we found quantity is much more important than quality. And this is something really new, because repeating something not really that high quality will work quite effectively in the 5G China, especially for commercial crisis for those companies. So that's second change. And third change, we say, is very much about the short videos effect. So in China, we say 短视频为王, short video as the king, as the queen. So it means that people started to ignoring texts. People started to being blind about the pictures, but people will only open their eyes and ears when they see TikTok short videos in China, because that's really the #1 platform for the Chinese speaking world at the moment. This is good in some way, because people are when they are doing the bad things, it's very hard to cover up. But it's also bad for some other, the real good people, is because short video, it means a small and how to say, it's a small angle, not a complete picture. It's very partial, it's not impartial. And this will very easily combine with emotional influences at the first stage of a crisis. People will be misled so easily. So the cost of compensation, the cost of making things back to the original check become at least also 50 times more expensive than ever before. People lose jobs more often. I mean, the CEOs, COOs, when they have really bad accidents. People will not wait until 24 or 48 or 72 hours later. Because for China, many of the commercial companies, they had the former calendar is like 24 hours telling something, 48 hours telling something. But now the requirement is 1 hour tell something, 4 hours telling something. They have to divide what they could tell by very small portions. So portion 1, very quick facts, and portion 2, very important, very importantly, the attitudes. So attitudes now more important than the real actions, and people will become, how do you say, they do not have, they will lose interest very quickly by the end of hour 5 or 6, because they will turn the channel to another new crisis, because China is big enough for many, many crises on a day among the companies. So this is also something I would like Fred to advise us with some new advices.
I'd like to both point to something I've said a long time, but I'm going to say it better because of this conference now. I used to say that in the early moments of crisis, the perfect is the enemy of the good enough. But I think I've learned from the prior session that imperfect is the new perfect. That our standard is to be just good enough to get it out there, because if we don't, our silence is seen to be indifference, which is toxic and causes trust to plummet, or it is seen to be validation. They wanted that, they caused that. And so we need to deprive others of that first mover advantage, and we need to be able to get out there quick enough so that we're not trying to restore trust, which is hard, but we're still at the level of maintaining trust, which is easier, but it requires real fast reaction in a smart way, not reaction in a dumb way, but reaction in a smart way. And that's why you want to think as much in advance as you can, make as many decisions in advance as you can. Now, to quote Lao Tzu, we do the difficult while it is still easy. We do the great while it is still small. And that's a foundational principle of crisis management.
Very interesting. We do why is it easy?
Oh, that's not my line.
Just going back to this, it was a change in the chat about critical thinking, how to build critical thinking. And you know, that it is taught in classes. But what about, well, you mentioned TikTok, and you know, that's what most people look at. What can be done, you know, in terms of the general public? You know, I mean, is there a contribution that whether governments or corporations, some, you know, what is the role they could take? I mean, obviously we have professors here and they know the role, and you're both teaching, and it's kind of, you have definitely an education role, but what about the general public? You know, I mean, if I may, we have the French elections. I'm based in Brussels and in Europe. And this is something, watching the presidential debate yesterday and looking then at the comments on Twitter and so on, it's, you really have that discrepancy between people who are saying, well, you know, candidate Macron had his facts, and others were saying, well, yes, but she was more sympathetic because he was so arrogant towards her. And you can see that there are people who don't care at the end about the facts. So are they, I mean, we don't have a lot of time for a dissertation on this, but what is it that could be put in place?
I'll be brief.
The critical thinking.
Right. I'll be brief. Since we started in France, let's go to France. The French philosopher Voltaire said, "Those who can make us believe absurdities can make us commit atrocities." And one of the things we find in misinformation is the statements that are made that are misinformation are logically absurdities. They don't make sense, but people believe it.
But how do you debunk that? That's my question.
One of the ways is you name it immediately.
All right.
You call it out immediately, not necessarily to the people who already believe it because they're already lost, but to the people who haven't yet been contaminated by it. I'll give one more quote. The American Catholic theologian and economist, Michael Novak, in his book, The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism, here I am being a professor, he says, the first moral obligation is to think clearly. And that's a discipline I teach all my graduate students and all of our clients, that clarity of thinking gets you through the crisis well. And part of the reason to have decision criteria clearly laid out in advance and answers to questions clearly laid out in advance is because in the moment of crisis, the amygdala fight, flight, freeze trigger in the back of our brain shuts down critical thinking. And so the question is, how do you jumpstart critical thinking? And you do that by asking a series of questions in a certain order in order to get people out of the panic or out of the dismay and into a productive resolution of the problem.
But you said a very interesting thing, which is before, you have to debunk it immediately before it becomes,
You can't move those who've already concluded that that's their point of view. But the discipline is to move the middle, move the people who are susceptible to being misled. And that's where the energies need to be. You're never going to persuade the people who've already convinced of the absurdity and have started acting on it. There are other ways that you can, at a smaller level, begin to move them. But in the moment, you got to get to the people who haven't been contaminated yet by the misinformation.
I have another question for both of you, which is something I've been asking myself, is how do you identify there's a crisis in the making? Personally, I rely more on my intuition. We say educated guesses, etc. But are there tools? We have a lot of students. Your students, by the way, someone wrote in the chat, they're very happy to see you, Fred. So I don't know who wants to pick it up first in terms of how do you identify there's a crisis in the making, and therefore you have to move very quickly.
I'll go first and fast and then hand off to my friend Stephen Dong. I believe most organizations and leaders define crisis incorrectly and therefore don't notice they're in crisis until it's too late. So I'm taken by the Greek word from which the English word crisis derives. That word is krisis. And in ancient Greek, krisis did not mean something bad happened. It meant a moment of choice where how you choose determines your destiny. And we have in English the vestige of that in the word criterion, which is the basis of choice, which also comes from krisis. If we see the crisis at the moment where trust is at risk, and that's the moment where we have the maximum control over the outcome, then we can make choices then to mitigate the harm before it has become public, or to minimize the visibility of it, because the visibility will include our positive reaction to it. And because we have Dr. Dong here, I'll also say one of the things I learned working with Dr. Dong in China is that the Chinese word for crisis, which is wei ji, combines within it both danger and opportunity. And if you mix the Chinese and the Greek ideas, that the crisis is the moment where you simultaneously face danger and opportunity. And the sooner you make the right choice, the more likely you are to end up in opportunity, and the less likely you are to end up in danger. I'll hand back to Stephen.
Stephen, on to you.
And the opportunity, the word in Chinese is also in a longer pattern. It's called a 先机, because we call opportunity either 机会 or 先机. What does it mean, 先机? 先机, it means early opportunity. It means prepare early enough. So really the philosophy for my practices, also my team, we are advising the copyright world in the way that when the information travel 50 times faster, and then we can prepare 50 times earlier. So that's what we are currently doing. Number one, how to identify there's a crisis. It's a big business now in China for the companies that lots of information early warning companies. So what does it mean? Those information companies will study the internet, and they will gather the negative news for the companies. So I have to say that more than 90% of the Chinese companies are now buying services from them. So there are lots of very leading business leaders now in this field. So for 5 or 6 years, they are only doing the information clipping and easy analyzing, but now they have lots of AI, they have lots of new technology. They can even gather information, audio visuals. So that's really helping the Chinese company to identify the dangers much earlier. And second, very importantly, in China is they started to do knowledge sharing early enough when they have certain area with not enough knowledge shared with people. In Chinese, we say 知识变常识，事实变共识. So having the knowledge, have the knowledge become common knowledge, have the reality as common facts or common consensus, something like that. This way, this process become harder than before. But when we start earlier, we can have jobs done better. For example, the Olympic Games in Beijing. It was not an easy job.
Our time is up,
sorry.
so just if you can wrap it up. It goes very fast, right?
Sorry, yeah.
I'm sorry.
I enjoy.
Okay, I'm sorry. Just don't want to take time from the next panel. I think this was interesting, and we can all take a few memos from what was shared here in terms of things to keep in mind. So thank you for that. And I have to admit, I'm very, very surprised how quickly the time went by. So Jacqueline, please give us a little bit more time next time. So the panel afterwards, and thank you very much both, and I was happy to meet you while we were discussing and preparing. The next panel will be about how brands formulate strategy around new non-fungible tokens. But before that, I think we're quite lucky to have with us Jeremy Monteiro, his jazz trio from Singapore. He's an accomplished composer, musician, author. He has 47 albums to his name. His current album is in the top 10 on the US jazz charts. So I'd say bravo on my behalf, and let's have a listen. And thank you again to Fred and Stephen Dong. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much.